Ethiopia's military was armed by foreign vendors for many years. The majority of heavy munitions, artillery shells, and bullets were imported and governed by outside forces. The nation's sovereignty and security were constantly at the mercy of an unjust international armaments trade. However, the rules are evolving nowadays. Machines hum, sparks fly, and robotic arms operate with surgical precision deep within Ethiopia's industrial heartland. Instead of protests, speeches, and the cacophony of manufacturing lines, a quiet revolution is taking place. Ethiopia is no longer merely a weapons buyer. It's turning into a producer. Additionally, it is now exporting ammunition for the first time on the international scene. However, how did this change take place? Let's investigate. Ethiopia's military infrastructure was reliant on foreign powers for a large portion of its modern history. Due to foreign alliances, colonial legacies, and geopolitical meddling, Ethiopian security was frequently determined by the accessibility of weaponry produced in other countries. However, a tipping point appeared in 1987. A silent but well-considered choice that would set the stage for a future nobody had yet anticipated. This choice gave rise to the Hamako ammunition engineering complex, which would grow into one of Ethiopia's most important defensive assets throughout time. The birth of Hamako was not isolated. It was created as a result of Cold War geopolitics, when Ethiopia was torn between changing military commitments and allies. Ethiopia set up its first significant ammunition production facility with the help of engineers from North Korea and the Soviet Union. The facility was initially limited in size and focused mostly on producing small-caliber bullets for infantry weapons. It was never supposed to be more than an additional production facility meant to lessen, not completely replace, dependency on imports. But then something took place. The world has evolved. The Soviet Union fell apart. Once dependable, foreign military aid stopped coming in. Self-reliance was now required rather than a choice as Ethiopia entered a new period of instability. The Hamato complex started to develop its capabilities with little outside assistance. It gradually evolved from a bullet factory into a multi-tiered manufacturing center that could produce anything from anti-aircraft ammunition to sniper rounds. However, approach was more important here than quantity. The leadership of Ethiopia recognized that the manufacturing of ammunition could not be viewed as merely another industrial endeavor. It required long-term vision, precision, and secrecy. The factory was expanded with new sections, each with a distinct focus on ammo types and calibers. Engineers received training in advanced metallurgy and ballistics, guaranteeing that Ethiopia's military would have dependable, high-performing ammunition in addition to ammunition. Operating mostly beneath the radar, Hamako grew to become one of East Africa's biggest military manufacturing plants by the early 2000s. Ethiopia has been making covert investments for years to create a supply network that would supply its armed forces. However, it wasn't prepared to supply the globe just yet. With the advent of contemporary automation and robots, everything was altered. Ethiopia took a risky step that marked the full industrialization of its military industry in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Hamako started incorporating computer-controlled precision machining and automated loading technologies in place of only using conventional assembly lines. Two factors made this change revolutionary. It significantly raised the output of production. Millions of rounds could now be produced at the plant in a fraction of the time previously required. It guaranteed dependability and regularity. Ethiopia was able to meet international military standards for ammunition because of automation. Hamako was more than just an Ethiopian factory by 2020. It was an industrial-scale production plant of the highest caliber. The transition of Ethiopia's armaments sector into civilian metal manufacturing is among its most underappreciated features. Although producing weapons is still the major priority, other sectors have profited from the metallurgical developments at Hamako. Specialized alloys used in industrial manufacturing are produced at the complex. For engineering and construction applications, certain of its facilities can produce precision-milled metal components. Hamako is now economically beneficial for purposes other than defense due to the overlap between military and civilian industry. Defense experts were aware of Ethiopia's ammunition output for many years, although it was rarely discussed in public. That is no longer the case. Ethiopia's current drive for economic independence has greatly boosted sectors like food, medicine, and textiles. The once secret Hamako facility is now a symbol of Ethiopian tenacity, and for the first time, the country is publicly embracing its own defense sector as a sign of power and independence. It stands for the notion that Ethiopia may forge its own military course, fortify its frontiers, and produce its own armaments without waiting for outside approval. However, this is not where the narrative ends. Domestic production was never intended to be the end for Hamako. Something new has occurred throughout the past 3 months. Ethiopia no longer produces only for its own use. Selling to the globe is what makes all the difference. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. The major purpose of Ethiopia's munitions business, which was confined within its borders for many years, was to arm the country's armed forces by producing bullets, storing artillery shells, and ensuring a consistent supply for national security. That was the extent of its function. However, something has changed. Ethiopia's military might no longer solely depend on ammunition. It's a commodity now. Ethiopia no longer produces only for its own use. The world is buying it. Ethiopia has won contracts for the sale of munitions totaling more than $30 million in just 3 months. This isn't conjecture. It's not a test. It's already taking place. Ethiopian industries are now meeting international demand in addition to manufacturing military weaponry. The world is paying attention to this remarkable change. It was more than simply a commercial transaction when the first Ethiopian ammunition shipments departed the nation's borders. It was a declaration. It proclaimed Ethiopia to be a player in the world arms trade on its own, capable of supplying other countries' war machines instead of relying on outside supplies. These cargo final destinations are still well guarded. Ethiopia is hardly an exception to the rule that governments seldom publicize their arms sales. However, there are rumors in defense circles that ammunition manufactured in Ethiopia has made its way into several continents. Middle Eastern consumers in need of large quantities of ammunition, African countries seeking to equip their armed forces, and even possible Asian markets. These are the countries searching for trustworthy, affordable, and large quantities of military supplies. Ethiopia is well positioned to provide thanks to its modernized production. This abrupt entry into the export of munitions was not an accident. It is the outcome of a confluence of international circumstances that made Ethiopia's rise as an arms supplier both feasible and, more significantly, lucrative. Military supply chains are being strained globally. Conflicts, political struggles, and production halts are the main concerns of the world's biggest armaments manufacturers, whether they are in the US, Russia, or Europe. In search of new suppliers that can provide ammunition in a timely, effective, and large-scale manner, several countries that formerly relied on the Western or Eastern superpowers are now searching elsewhere. Ethiopia has filled this void by providing these countries with just what they require: a consistent supply of ammunition free from political unrest, bureaucratic holdups, or regular vendors' exorbitant prices. However, Ethiopia's armament exports are causing a stir for another reason. Autonomy is more important than affordability alone. Countries who have long faced severe arms embargoes, political pressures, and diplomatic challenges when interacting with conventional arms exporters make up a large portion of the buyers that are turning to Ethiopia. Ethiopia now presents them with an alternative that is free from constraints and meddling and has a foreign policy objective. Ethiopia hasn't just constructed an ammunition plant behind the scenes. It has established a pipeline for exports. Selling weapons is not the same as selling textiles or coffee. It necessitates a highly specialized infrastructure, logistics networks capable of managing sensitive cargo, security protocols that guarantee secure and private transportation, and diplomatic agreements that permit the lawful cross-border movement of ammunition. Ethiopia has taken action to expedite this procedure, establishing a structure that enables its weaponry to be delivered to customers quickly and effectively. Shipments can be transported via sea channels with little delay thanks to the nation's advantageous location near the port of Djibouti. In order to prevent Ethiopia's ammunition exports from becoming entangled in the same kind of bureaucratic red tape that has slowed down arms sales in other countries, negotiations are currently taking place for direct military trade agreements. Fundamentally, the upgraded Homoko munitions engineering facility in Ethiopia has increased production to keep up with demand. Ethiopia is now able to produce millions of rounds with constant quality thanks to the transition to robotic precision production, guaranteeing that customers will receive goods that satisfy international military requirements. However, Ethiopia must carefully manage a new set of challenges that come with joining the global arms market. Every time a bullet is fired from an Ethiopian factory, strong interests are paying attention. The international arms trade is not a sector that readily accepts new participants. Some of the most powerful governments and businesses in the world control it, and Ethiopia's unexpected entry as a supplier of ammunition upends a market that has historically been dominated by Western and Eastern giants. These well-established arms manufacturers are already displaying signs of discomfort. Ethiopia may soon face diplomatic pressure to restrict its exports if it keeps increasing its output and luring in more customers. Ethiopia's expanding arms trade is probably seen by some Western countries in particular as a threat to their own economic and geopolitical clout in Africa. Ethiopia's action, however, might improve its relations with other developing military economies, especially in Asia and Africa. Ethiopia may be viewed by some countries as more than just a supplier of weapons, but as a key ally in the Global South's efforts to develop an independent defense sector. If this pattern persists, Ethiopia may be able to produce more than just ammunition. It may also be able to produce armored vehicles, larger weapon systems, and even defense technologies. However, there are difficulties. Maintaining production capacity without overstretching its resources will be one of the most difficult tasks. Ethiopia may face supply shortages or problems with quality control if it expands too quickly without securing long-term customers and sustainable production lines. Building enduring military trade relationships and attracting repeat customers, not just for one-time purchases, but for ongoing sizable purchases, will be crucial to success. The issue of geopolitical resistance is another. The world's largest arms producers do not take kindly to competition, especially from a rising African nation. Ethiopia's leadership must prepare for potential political and economic hurdles, ensuring that it does not fall into the same pitfalls that have impeded other developing arms exporters. However, one thing is evident. Ethiopia has already made its move. The first shipments have left its bounds. The first contracts have been signed. The first million have been earned. This is not a test run. This is the actual stuff. Ethiopia is not merely an arms-producing nation anymore. It is now an armaments exporting power. So the question is, what this means for Africa? For years, Africa's military landscape has been defined by dependency. Most nations relied on Western, Russian, or Chinese suppliers for everything from light guns to large artillery. The arms trade was a game performed by superpowers, a market where African nations were simply customers, trapped into deals that often came with hidden stipulations. Ethiopia is bucking that pattern. It is no longer just a buyer, it is now a seller. There is more to this change than just economics. It is a geopolitical statement. It means that Ethiopia is beginning to alter the balance of military power in Africa, One bullet at a time. What does this signify for the continent, though? What does it signify for Ethiopia specifically? In terms of defense, African countries have been caught in a vicious cycle of reliance on outside help for many years. Foreign companies dominated the procurement of weapons, which frequently resulted in agreements that benefited the supplier rather than the buyer. African countries frequently had to deal with political limitations, delays, or outright rejections from conventional arms exporters, even when they paid billions for military imports. The armaments sector in Ethiopia is an example of a weakness in this framework. An African country is becoming a regional provider of military-grade ammunition for the first time, not only for its army, but also for other forces. Ethiopia might establish a model for other African countries to follow if it keeps moving in this direction. Countries on the continent might start focusing on their own defense needs rather than relying on the US, Russia, or Europe. Ethiopia's exports of ammunition may mark the beginning of a much larger continental trend toward independent military manufacturing. But Ethiopia's growth in the ammunition market is not happening in a vacuum. Each bullet it exports is one that isn't purchased from conventional vendors. For the global arms giants, this is bad news. African defense contracts have been a significant source of income for international arms manufacturers for many years. Countries like the United States, France, the UK, and Russia have long had a monopoly over African military procurement. They have created networks of influence, acquired multi-year contracts, and positioned themselves as the default suppliers for African governments. Now Ethiopia is challenging that dominance. Ammunition may be the initial cause, but there could be far-reaching consequences. What is stopping other African countries from becoming a reliable, trustworthy arms supplier if Ethiopia is successful in doing so? Ethiopia's rise is more than just an economic one because of this. It poses a threat to the status quo. History has demonstrated that international powers respond when a country jeopardizes their economic interests. Will diplomatic pressure be applied to Ethiopia to reduce its exports? Will new arms trade regulations aimed at African producers be introduced by international organizations? These are actual possibilities. Money is not the only factor in the global arms trade. It has to do with control. Ethiopia appears to be moving away from that rule. As the entire world observes Ethiopia's shipments of weaponry, something equally significant is taking place in the nation. The Ethiopian military has evolved beyond a simple force. It is developing into a force in industry. An army is only as good as its supply network for the majority of countries. Soldiers alone do not win wars. They are won by logistics. By the capacity to maintain the aircraft's fuel, the tank's motion, and the bullet's flow. Ethiopia today has a self-sustaining military sector, something that many African countries do not have. Everything is altered by this. Ethiopia can now replenish its ammunition without waiting for international consent. For basic military supplies, it does not have to spend millions on international arms contracts. Without depending on outside shipments, Ethiopia can continue to produce weapons in the case of a crisis. Few African countries have reached this degree of independence. It's not only about war either. Ethiopia's defense sector keeps its armed forces well equipped even during times of calm without breaking the bank. Ethiopia is reinvesting in its economy, retaining money domestically rather than sending it abroad, in contrast to countries that spend billions on military imports. Ethiopia may start establishing military trade partnerships with its neighbors if it keeps increasing the amount of ammunition it produces. Imagine a defense network in Africa, where countries exchange weapons without interference from the West. What if the African Union started giving preference to armaments produced in Africa? What if Ethiopia formed a regional arms industry in collaboration with nations like Nigeria, Egypt, or Algeria? What if the first Pan-African defense manufacturing bloc was born out of Ethiopia's munitions production? The questions are no longer hypothetical. The procedure has already started. The last query: is Ethiopia able to stay independent? The risk of outside intervention increases with Ethiopia's weapons sector. It's possible that the Western and Eastern nations that previously controlled Africa's armaments supply won't readily relinquish that authority. To impede Ethiopia's progress, they might employ political scheming, economic pressure, or even clandestine influence. These obstacles will require careful handling by the Ethiopian government. It must establish long-term defense agreements with African countries to guarantee consistent ammunition exports, develop its technological capabilities to maintain production and quality leadership, fortify its domestic sector, ensuring that, in spite of outside pressure, Ethiopia's military is adequately armed. It is not just factories that will determine the future of Ethiopia's military industry. Ethiopia's performance in the geopolitical game will determine the outcome. Ethiopian ammunition is currently a symbol of a new form of African independence, rather than merely a weapon of war. Which country do you think will follow Ethiopia's lead? Will the West intervene? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.